Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
The story begins with the emergence of the Saiyan kingdom. Long ago, on the continent of Mu, there was a kingdom called Sane, and in it lived a princess with shining golden eyes and hair. This princess's name was Sophia, and when she came of age, the kingdom held a huge ball in her honor. However, in the middle of this celebration, an uninvited guest suddenly appeared, and this guest was a magician. He was afraid that the princess's magic would surpass his power, so he cast a special curse on her. After this, the kingdom became overgrown with tall turf bushes, and the people, one and all, abandoned the ungrateful land. Thus in Sina there was no one left except the damned rulers who remained to guard this castle forever. And the question immediately arises, what ultimately happened to this princess who was cursed? And the answer to it is quite simple. She continued to live in this castle, and she had to solve various household chores and all that sort of thing. And so one sunny day she, as always, was in the backyard of her castle and was collecting various weeds, of which there were a lot. She sighed heavily, thinking that there was no end to these weeds, but then she suddenly heard some strange sound behind her. The girl immediately looked at the sky and saw how it suddenly began to become covered with various cracks, especially in one place. She couldn't believe that this had actually happened, because those cracks meant that the barrier had been destroyed. Without thinking twice, the girl immediately stood up and started running. She was very happy that this was really happening. She was in pretty good physical shape, so she was able to get to her room very quickly, even jumping over a pretty high fence. It had been 147 years and 3 days since her miserable life, locked up and without any abilities, had begun. And when these cracks appeared above the girl's head, she was very happy about what was happening, because it meant that she would finally be able to remove her curse. Without thinking twice, she ran into her room and, quickly taking off her shoes, sat down on a small cushion in order to take the correct position. As soon as she heard footsteps in the hallway, her heart began to flutter even more, because she was simply in anticipation. And so, when the door opened, the man saw a very strange picture in front of him, which he certainly did not expect to see. This prince saw in the princess's room a small white chicken, which was sitting on this soft pillow. At that moment he passed by the animal and began to look around, just in search of the princess. Meanwhile, the girl herself began to examine him carefully. She noticed that he had things like a real hero. However, he came completely unarmed, so she assumed that he most likely had magical abilities. But then she suddenly took a closer look at his shoulder straps and saw there a rather familiar, but at the same time, strange coat of arms. At this point, the man finally spoke. He looked very angry, and slamming his hand on the table, said that apparently they had been led by the nose after all. He was very upset, because he could not believe that all his knights who went on this mission died in vain. There was nothing of importance in that place except that chicken, and he wasn't sure it could be of any use at all. As soon as the princess in the body of this very animal heard this, she called him a boor. The guy, hearing this, immediately stopped. He looked at the chicken in surprise and could not believe that she had actually just said this in a human voice. But his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by one of the knights, who ran in and, turning to His Highness, asked how he could have left alone. He immediately looked at his assistant, whose name was Paul, and asked him to immediately find the sword, because there was a cursed chicken in this place that needed to be gotten rid of. As soon as his assistant heard this, he was very surprised and asked what he was talking about. But at that moment, the princess again turned to the two of them with irritation in her voice. She said that they were showing great disrespect to the only heir to the kingdom of Sa, and while attacking the man, she told him to repent for it. Of course, this prince immediately started running away because he was very scared of this crazy chicken and did not understand how this was even possible. But he knew only one thing: it was better not to mess with her. After some time, when they had all calmed down, the girl finally explained the whole situation to them in detail and said that everything was correct. It was she, Sophia Brianna V, the princess. Of course, it was hard for these knights from another empire to take her word seriously, because they saw her in the form of a chicken. By that time, the prince even summoned one magician, whom he had taken with him on the expedition, and asked Orwell if they weren't supposed to find the sleeping princess. The man bowed and said that this was indeed the case. That was exactly what they had been told to do. Then the man sighed heavily and said that his head was already completely confused. For a while, he even thought that he had gone completely crazy. After thinking about the situation a little more, he said that there was no problem in this in principle. The main thing was that the princess was there, even if she was in the form of a bird. Sophia then, looking intently at the man, said that he was the emperor of Croatia. But be that as it may, she did not understand that this gave him the right to disrespect a representative of a kingdom that was not even one of their vassal kingdoms. The man then became very angry and began to argue with the chicken, asking whether a country in which there was nothing but thorn bushes could be called a kingdom at all. At this point, Orwell turned to His Highness and asked for forgiveness for his rudeness, but said that one could only joke as long as it was funny. The emperor, hearing about this, was very surprised and, looking at him, asked what he was talking about because he did not understand when he started joking. Then Orwell sighed heavily, looked away from the emperor, and said that he had been talking to this chicken for the last few minutes. So he asked him to remember that the order was always watching him. At that moment, the emperor looked at him and the other knights who were standing behind him in surprise and asked if he was the only one who could hear this chicken. At that moment, Sophia began to scream loudly. Of course, no one present heard her voice. They all heard the sound that the animal made. And the emperor tried to explain to them that she was saying that she was the only surviving princess of the kingdom of Sane. But people only thought that His Majesty had simply gone mad during this entire expedition. They did not understand how this could have happened, but decided that he was simply too tired, and that was why he had gone mad. At this point, the emperor became seriously wary, especially when he heard these whispers. It was hard for him to believe that no one else really heard her words except him. Then, in order to make sure of his thoughts, he immediately reached out to her and wanted to stroke her, but the girl immediately felt a threat to herself. So she started using a special spell, which unfortunately didn't work as she expected and blew up almost her entire room. Of course, the emperor was very surprised when this happened. He did not understand how this was even possible, but he managed to dodge this wave of fire in time. At this very moment, Orwell activated another spell to stop this fire, and asking forgiveness from His Majesty, he said that he should not have doubted him. After that, he looked at the other knights and asked what they were waiting for, since they should already be drawing their swords because this was attack magic. Then he ran up to His Majesty and said that he was indeed right. This chicken was Princess Sophia, and they must catch her immediately. The girl herself, in the noise, managed to break away from them a little and ran headlong. At that moment, she even cried a little because of the strong feelings that overwhelmed her. The girl understood that she had hoped in vain again, because these boars were clearly not heroes who would lift her curse. She ran as fast as she could and didn't understand why she even believed the words of this stupid magician. After some time, the knights returned to the emperor's room and asked if everything was okay with him, because the explosion was quite strong. But the man ignored their question and asked where the chicken was. By that time, Orwell had returned. The boy handed him his own cloak, and the magician bowed and said that she had run away. However, they would definitely find her soon. But then he asked, with surprise in his voice, how he even knew that the chicken was really Princess Sophia. The emperor looked at his magician in surprise and said that she had actually told him about it herself. As soon as Orwell heard about it, he was very surprised and asked what he meant. Well, the emperor, just waving his hand, told him to forget about it, because he didn't understand why he was asking at all if he wouldn't believe his words anyway. The magician bowed and said that, of course, this was not so. He believed it. It just all sounded a little strange and bizarre. At this moment, the knights who were also standing there lowered their heads because they felt very ashamed that they considered the emperor to be insane. At that moment, the man did not answer them anymore, but only began to leave. Orwell stood up and asked where he was going, but the guy didn't answer him. He only asked that the others not follow him. He explained his request by saying that it wasn't that he didn't trust them. It was just that they couldn't waste any more time, so he was going to deal with the princess himself. Sophia, meanwhile, managed to hide very professionally from several knights. But while she was running, she continued to cry because she was too upset. She had already planted hope in her heart that this time everything would work out. She really wanted to believe that this emperor who came to her could free her from the curse. However, in the end, he turned out to be like everyone else. At this moment, he had already entered the main corridors of the estate and began to slowly walk along them. Emperor Lenik knew that she had jumped out the window, so she should have already ended up in the palace garden. But at that moment, passing by a portrait that hung on the wall, he suddenly stopped and began to look closely at the people who were painted there. Of course, it was hard for him to believe that this lady and the chicken could be the same person. But then suddenly, he looked more closely at the frame in which this picture was framed and noticed a small white feather. Lenik immediately came up and took it off, and saw that there were also many white feathers scattered on the grass on the left side. The man was well aware that it was the princess who had scattered her feathers, so when he walked on them, he even thought that she was asking to be grabbed. Soon he arrived at the right destination, and seeing the princess, he turned to her in a quiet voice, saying that he wanted to talk. But Sophia, whose head was buried in the ground and only her backside remained on the surface, did not answer him. The man was silent for a while, then said that she knew better than anyone that running away would not solve anything. After that, he took her small chute in his hands and pulled the head out of the ground. Lenik, looking her straight in the eyes, suggested pretending that that incident in the room had not happened because he was sure that they were both worried, so they said and did a lot of things that they shouldn't have. Sophia sighed heavily and asked what he was talking about. Then the man explained that he would forget everything she had done there. Of course, this made her even more angry, and she couldn't believe that he even had the nerve to say such a thing. It was hard for her to understand and accept the fact that he wanted to say that her magic was so harmless that he could forgive everything so easily. Of course, she was very sad about this fact, because before she was called the genius magician of the empire, and if she weren't in the body of a chicken, then he, of course, would have respected her more and wouldn't have given such stupid ultimatums. But since she was in another body, she had no choice. So Sophia, turning away from the man, asked him to just leave her alone. As he continued to hold her in his arms, the girl screamed, saying that she was already very embarrassed about being stuck in this hole. So she asked him to stop talking and just leave. At that moment, the man immediately looked at the small hole that had formed in the ground and noticed that it was too narrow for the entire chicken to hide there. Lenik turned to her and said that at least she was stuck for a little while, but the girl immediately interrupted him and asked him to shut up, and also asked if he really hadn't understood anything at all from what she had said. The guy could barely hold back his laughter, but hanging his head down, he asked for forgiveness and said that in any case. But Lenik didn't have time to finish his sentence because Sophia interrupted him, saying that she couldn't even die and continued to gain weight, although she ended up eating only grass. The girl screamed and cried all the time, but then the man suddenly asked with surprise in his voice if she really only ate grass. She said with disgust in her voice that this was indeed so. Then the emperor, continuing to hold back his laughter with all his might, replied that it was probably very hard for her. He was about to add something else, but she interrupted him again and said that, of course, it was hard, and asked if a strange, unfamiliar magician had ever come to him to confess his love. Lenik, of course, took her words seriously, so he replied that they didn't have any female mages in the imperial palace, so nothing like that happened. Then she asked, "What about the curse for this man rejecting this love?" Lenik was then a little surprised and said that he thought that this magician was simply jealous of her magic. The girl completely lost the thread of the conversation and did not understand what he was talking about at all. By that time, she was finally able to get out of his hands and, flying, jumped onto a tree. At the same time, she wondered in surprise whether people really didn't know the whole story and thought that she was a chicken just because she lost to this magician. The emperor was surprised that she did not know about this, since it was a well-known legend, so he told her so. Then he looked at the girl who had already sat on the tree and asked if that was not so. He also said that if she could get rid of all the thorny bushes that covered the kingdom of Sane, he would take care of these rumors. Sophia, meanwhile, looked at him suspiciously and asked if he really was Emperor Croy. Stretching her clawed paw forward, she said that it all sounded like he was trying to conquer her kingdom. After that, she started flying in the air and said that it was just a shame and disgrace on his part to do this. With her head held high, she flew in the air and thought that this would only happen over her dead body, and she would try to run as far away from him as possible. But unfortunately, she did not succeed, because the man, stretching his arms forward, grabbed her by her small body and began to head back to the estate, saying that she was just a chicken, not a hawk. As soon as they returned to the estate, the emperor immediately put her in a golden cage so that she would not escape again. Then he sat down opposite her and told her to listen to him carefully. Lennox explained that he had absolutely no plans to conquer her state. Before this, the girl was very angry, so she used a small magical ability and burned the tips of his hair. That's why he put her in a cage. Sophia then asked with surprise and suspicion why she should take his word for it. She asked what guarantee she would have that once she got rid of the thorns, his army would not invade her country. The emperor sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness for upsetting her. However, they didn't even need to go that far. The man explained that time was passing and the kingdom of Sane would naturally become part of the empire. So this moment was inevitable. He also asked her to let him ask him something and wondered how she was going to protect and maintain this kingdom when no one else lived there. Lennox explained that she was left in this kingdom completely alone, so he does not understand what she is even trying to fight for. Sophia then said in a detached and quiet voice that the descendants of the people of Sena would definitely return, and then their country would flourish again. But the man with a smile on his face asked, "Is she really sure about this?" Sophia replied that of course, because this earth is hers, the ruler still remains. So one day, her curse will be lifted, and those who grew up listening to the story of the Sayana, passed down by their ancestors, will return in search of their roots. The emperor, turning away from her, sighed heavily and said that she could speak as she liked, and he would like to see whose prophecy would ultimately come true. He also said that he would very much like the curse that blocks the river's flow to be lifted, and the final outcome was completely unimportant to him. After that, he asked how she was going to get rid of the bushes. Sophia got even more angry about this, yelled at him, said that she was already tired of repeating the same thing. She can't do it. Having calmed down a little, she sighed heavily and said that if everything were so simple, then she wouldn't have this curse. However, now she can very weakly control her magic. Lennox thoughtfully asked, "Will she really be able to do this only after she removes this curse and becomes human again?" The girl was immediately happy that he was finally beginning to understand and said that this was really so, and that was exactly why she needed a hero. At this time, his men began to carry various things around the estate, and the man, sitting on the cart, asked, "Is it really only a hero who can lift the curse?" Sophia replied that it could be a hero, a warrior, a knight. It didn't matter at all. The most important thing is that he did it and really wanted to. Then the man remained in his place and said that a knight was quite plausible. However, they do not live in a time when typical heroes and warriors exist. By that time, a man with many books in his hands approached the emperor. He asked him to hurry up because they had to leave soon. As soon as Lennox turned and looked at the guy who approached him, he immediately saw that it was Orwell, and a good thought came to his mind. He looked at the man without taking his eyes off him and asked, "Is it true that he had practiced fencing before?" The man, embarrassed, replied that it was indeed so, and the emperor meanwhile said that in that case he was technically a knight too. Orwell was a little surprised by this suggestion, but said that it didn't really work that way. But Lennox said that if he wanted something more formal, he asked, "How about officially knighting Orwell right here on this very spot?" As soon as Sophia heard this, she was very surprised, as was the magician. They did not understand what was happening at all. But the man was already beaming with joy and said that he saw no reason to delay. He would confer on Orwell the honor of being the first great magician of the empire to be knighted. Orwell, despite not understanding why this was necessary, nevertheless agreed, because he could not refuse the title of knight. The emperor meanwhile came closer to him and, putting his hand on his shoulder, said that this was very good because he knew that the guy would be the one. But at that moment the man became wary and asked, "For what purpose will he be the one?" Then Lennox answered that he would be a hero, a warrior and a knight who would lift the curse from the princess. He lifted the girl up and said that he was giving him the opportunity to remove the curse from her, and also added that it was a great honor. The emperor also asked Mr. Orwell to give the princess a kiss of promise. When the man heard this, He even dropped all his books and did not understand what was happening to His Majesty. After a short silence, he finally turned to Lennox and asked, "Why is he so sure that this chicken is Princess Sophia?" But the man, looking at him, replied that he had already told him more than once. This girl herself told him about it. At that moment, Sophia very proudly raised her head up and agreed with him. But Orwell did not understand anything. He only heard her speaking in animal language. Picking up his books from the floor, Orwell wondered if he could ask her the question, "What is the most difficult magic potion to make?" The man immediately looked at the chicken, and the girl, without thinking twice, replied that, of course, it was a love potion. The Emperor, looking at his assistant, said that she replied that it was a love potion. Orwell thought about it at this point because he heard confusion in His Majesty's voice. The man did not even believe that such a potion could exist. The man also thought that if he could really communicate with her, then it would be quite an interesting experience. Having put all the books on the cot, Orwell said that he asked for forgiveness, but could not speak to Princess Sophia or even understand her intentions. Therefore, according to his modest observations, he believes that Lennox is destined for her. Sophia and the Emperor were surprised to hear this, and the magician continued speaking, saying that there was no other explanation for why he was the only one who could communicate with her. So he wondered why the two of them didn't just do it and be done with it. But before they could hear the end of the sentence, they both immediately started screaming that it would never happen. The Emperor was shouting loudly and saying that he was not going to kiss the chicken. But then he suddenly saw how nervous Sophia was in the cage and asked what she was doing. Orwell eventually decided to write a letter of resignation as soon as they returned to the Empire, because he realized that in his chatter, he had simply wanted to make a man kiss a poor animal. The Emperor had no choice. He wanted to do it anyway. But because Sophia kept running away, they were both exhausted and did not kiss. So, lying on the grass, the man suggested postponing this kiss for another day. Sophia, breathing heavily, said that she already thought that he would not ask about it. By that time, even Orwell had changed his clothes and, approaching His Majesty, said that it was time for them to leave. "The Emperor, get up on your feet," he said to the princess, and told her to get ready. But then the magician suddenly remembered that there was something regarding her transportation. Sophia understood perfectly well that this would not be good. And indeed, as soon as they sat down and began to leave, the way they treated her was completely unpalatable to her. Lennox simply sat her on his arm. Then, after riding some distance, she looked at him and asked if he could really treat the princess of an entire kingdom like that. But the man replied that it would be better for everyone. After all, she was not a prisoner of war, and they could not transport a royal person simply in a cage. To keep the girl from getting upset, he stroked her head and said that, besides, a chicken cannot ride on horseback or in a carriage, so this was the only way out in their case. Sophia, of course, was very angry and unhappy. She already wanted to tell him something, but the man interrupted and replied that her anger was completely unnecessary in this situation. The girl was even more angered by this phrase, and she simply took and bit his hand. Lennox screamed loudly and asked why she did that at all. And the princess replied that he should stop petting her and lead the horse normally without getting distracted. At that moment, she herself thought that she had to endure him only because of her curse and because he took her away from her native estate, that's all. After a long silence, Lennox looked her in the eye and said that just in case, he would like to warn her. Any actions aimed at harming the Emperor are usually regarded as treason. Sophia then said in a rough voice that in that case he should punish her as soon as the man heard it. He was very surprised and asked what she meant. She replied that he could do whatever he wanted, as long as he didn't mind going down in history as the first ruler of an empire to execute a chicken for treason. As soon as Lennox heard this, he immediately realized that it really was a stupid warning on his part, because people who would study history later would simply laugh at him. He sighed heavily and said that it was all just awful. They drove on and were silent for a while, but at that moment the girl, suddenly turning to the side, noticed something strange, and immediately, turning to the Emperor, asked why the other knights who were accompanying them were lined up so strangely. The guy himself looked away, and then explained that since they needed to break through as quickly as possible, they threw out all the unnecessary luggage. Sophia, hearing that they would be breaking through somewhere, was very surprised and asked if everything was really that bad there. And the emperor asked her what she thought about why he came alone. But he also said that she shouldn't worry. After all, that was why he took Orville with him. Despite his appearance, this guy was simply an excellent magician and carried the ornament of the imperial family with him. So he had better do his job without anyone bothering him. As soon as Sophia looked at all the jewelry that was on the horse, she immediately realized what it could be, and Lennox confirmed her guess. He said that these were mana stones that cost more than half of the annual imperial budget. She, hearing about this, was very surprised and could not believe that such surpluses were really so necessary. But at that moment, one of the knights approached them and told him to his face that they had almost reached the thorn bush. At that moment, the guy turned to Orwell, but he didn't even have to say anything, because the magician already knew everything perfectly well and understood what he needed to do. He began to activate his magical abilities, and with their help, he managed to make some kind of symbol, and the emperor said that this was their last resort. After that, he raised his sword up and ordered the other knights to get ready. They also immediately took out their weapons and were ready to strike if necessary. Sophia was very surprised at this point. She said that she really appreciated their persistence, but she didn't understand what all the talk about the thorns was about, because once they got to the fences, they weren't that scary. As soon as the emperor stopped and looked at it carefully, he was very surprised. He said that he did not understand anything because he was not lying at all. There were many thorns that needed to be destroyed. He continued to scream and said that these plants were simply terrible, and each one was 2 meters long. They threw his knights around like rag dolls and cut up their entire bodies. Sophia immediately asked if there were many victims, but the man replied that no one even died in the end. But at that moment, the girl turned somewhere to the side and, pointing there, said that she had noticed this building a long time ago and asked if by chance this was the imperial castle of Croy. The man was already beginning to understand what she was getting at and said that it really was him. And Sophia then, sighing heavily, said that they were already 2 steps away from him. Lennox, hearing this, got angry and started shouting, saying that she apparently didn't even understand how long it had taken them to get to her castle. However, Sophia replied that most likely their journey hadn't even taken half a day, since they only had to cross the river. The man said that, of course, on the one hand it all seems simple. However, the thorns are very sinister and could not let them near the castle for a very long time. But Sophia had already stopped listening to him and asked who he was to talk about villains, because he was the real villain, because he came to her kingdom without asking. From this description, she got the impression that the thorns were like knights who defended her country. As soon as the man heard this, he was very surprised. After that, he turned to the princess and asked if she really thought that the river belonged only to her kingdom. Sophia was a little surprised when she heard this and immediately asked what he meant when he asked such a question. Then the emperor explained that he was saying that they were in a situation where there was no choice but to cross the borders of her country, and if it weren't for that, he was afraid to even imagine how it would have all ended. As a result, Sophia, having looked at the gloomy Lennox, remained silent as if showing him her sympathy. She understood perfectly well that most likely he had many problems that he did not want to talk about. But she didn't dwell on it for long, and in the end, Sophia simply ran away the second they arrived at the imperial castle of Croy, because she thought that it wasn't her problem and she could do what she wanted. Of course, the emperor was very angry when he found out that she had run away from him again, because he thought that they had already finally come to an agreement. But apparently this was not the case. That same evening, when Lennox came to his office, having fulfilled all his duties, he turned to Orwell and asked if he had made a mistake. He covered his face with his hands and, sighing heavily, asked how chickens could fly so well. The magician bowed and asked His Majesty not to worry so much, because this was an easily solved problem. He explained that their people were already looking for the girl, so he would have her very soon, so he shouldn't worry about it so much. The emperor looked at his assistant with irritation and said that it was as if he did not know how many chickens there were in the world. Orwell looked out the window at that moment and said that even if they didn't find her, she would soon understand how harsh the world outside was, and then the bird would return to them on its own. So everything was fine. After that, he turned to the emperor again and said that now was the perfect time to ask him something. The man immediately became wary and asked, "What kind of question is this?" And the magician replied that he wanted to know if the man was absolutely sure that the chicken was Princess Sophia. Lennox, when he heard this question again, became very angry. But before he could say anything, Orwell explained his warnings by saying that the thorns retreated when she was with them. However, they were certainly the work of the magician who had cast a curse on the kingdom of Cyan. And as if the curse was not enough, he created thorns in order to lock the princess in the castle. But Orwell, then looking the man straight in the eye, asked why, in that case, these thorns so calmly allowed the girl to leave this very castle. Lennox, getting up from his seat, asked, "Does he really mean to say that the chicken could turn out to be the very one who cursed the princess?" He took off his jacket and asked, "Does he really think that he is pretending to be Princess Sophia on purpose?" Orwell knew how pathetic this sounded, but he said he simply thought it was not worthwhile to completely rule out the possibility and trust the girl's word entirely. The man asked, "Does the magician really think that this wizard could become a victim of his own curse? And for more than 100 years too?" Orwell explained that sometimes spells can have an outcome that is different from what the caster intended. And besides, the only proof that she is a princess is her words. The emperor sighed heavily and said that wherever you looked, there was a headache. More questions than answers in the end. But in any case, he thought they needed to focus more on the meeting. So before he left, he turned to Orwell and told him to go and get any white chicken he could find. The boy, hearing about this, was very surprised and asked what he was talking about, and also asked why they didn't send the nobles home and postpone this meeting until they finally found the real princess. Lennox explained that the unmarried and childless emperor insisted on an expedition that cost half of their empire's annual budget. So the man was absolutely sure that the guy understood the importance and necessity of this meeting, so he could not just tell the residents to disperse. The magician, lowering his head, asked him for forgiveness for his short-sightedness, and said that now he really saw that it was impossible to do this. As soon as the emperor heard his sad tone, he immediately looked at the guy, and then, in order to cheer him up a little, he put his hand on his shoulder and smiled. After that, he opened the door behind him and said that if he understood everything, then he could go and quickly find the white chicken. Some time had passed since then. It was already getting dark outside, and in the meantime, Sophia was hiding in the bushes not far from the estate. She saw many people around her. There were servants, knights, even nobles came to this place. But with no heroes or warriors on the horizon, she simply had to find a knight to lift her terrible curse. Sophia decided to look for the knight who had a golden badge with an eagle. And in order to find him, she decided to go to where the Imperial Guard is, and this is the Order of the Eagle. After some time, she was able to get there. And so 3 whole days had passed since Sophia's escape. Every night, screams could be heard coming from the Order of the Eagle, and a rumor had even spread around the area that chilled the souls of all people. And these rumors provided the emperor with very reliable protection. All the servants in the estate whispered and discussed all this news. One of the maids even said that many knights in Oral had not become their victims. She spoke of someone touching their lips in the middle of the night and then running away. The other maid was very shocked to hear this and could not believe what kind of person could do such a thing. The emperor himself, having overheard this conversation, immediately realized that Princess Sophia was doing such things in order to remove the curse from herself. At that moment, Orwell came up to him from behind and said that he really thought so too, because it was quite logical. The magician also said that all the injured knights had taken part in the expedition to her city, so she thought that one of them could help her get rid of the curse. Lennox agreed with him and said that this was, of course, all good, but he still did not understand why she had to reach for their lips and run away. Then the guy suggested that this was most likely her idea of a kiss, because in all fairy tales this is the only way to remove a spell. However, she is almost a cowardly chicken, so she is not capable of more. As soon as the emperor heard these words, he sighed heavily and said that this was probably why she had caused him so much trouble in the past few days. At every meeting, he had to bring the most ordinary chicken, which was afraid of everyone, and tell the aristocrats that this was Princess Sophia. So after a while, he said he couldn't take it anymore. If they couldn't catch her by normal means, they would have to set a special trap for it. Meanwhile, Sophia always changed the place where she would sleep, so that she would not be found. And one day it turned out to be the laundry room. She was lying in a laundry basket, and suddenly she made sounds that animals usually make. This scared the princess terribly, but looking around, she was very glad that there was no one nearby and no one heard it. Soon she stopped lying there, and having flown, realized that all this was just a waste of time. The girl was incredibly upset that she hadn't succeeded. She really hoped that the emperor wouldn't be the hero who would lift the curse from her. She was irritated by the disappointments all around her. She couldn't do anything the way she had planned. Suddenly, she began to think about how she could get into his bedroom. But the thought of it made her feel a little sick. She decided that this would only be the most extreme and last resort when she had nothing left. So, opening the window to fly further, she decided to try absolutely all the nights in the order to be completely sure. She had to take advantage of her chicken position. So, encouraging herself, she decided that she would succeed and headed back to the order. And so, when night fell, she snuck into one of the bedrooms and was very worried. The girl assumed that it was because of the increased security, but she didn't know for sure. Sophia walked slowly towards the bed, where one of the knights was sleeping, and thought that the air seemed especially cold to her. She could read the sign that said his name. It was Sir Chen, and she didn't know how many kisses he had already received. However, she was very sorry that she had to give him another one. Sophia thought that she would do all this very quickly. When she flew up, she immediately saw that it was him lying on the bed, and was about to do it, when suddenly something unusual happened. The guy lying in the bed was not a knight at all. It was the emperor himself. And as soon as he saw Sophia flying up, he reached out to her with his hand. Lennox, smiling happily, said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. As soon as Sophia saw and heard his voice, she simply froze in place. She certainly didn't expect to see him. The girl tried to fly back, but it was all useless, because the man was faster than her and grabbed her leg. Sophia started yelling at him loudly, asking how he dared to do that to a lady. But Lennox explained that it was not forbidden to touch chicken feet. And with an evil grin, he also said that he believed that they had something to discuss, so they needed to do it as soon as possible. And as soon as they walked out the door, he immediately yelled at her, asking if she could hold still for at least a second, since she had already scratched him all over. However, Sophia started yelling back at him and asked, what idiot would be calm in such a situation? So, continuing to yell, she asked him to let her go immediately. But the emperor made a different decision for himself. He put her in a sack, so that it would be easier for him to talk to her. For some time, the girl continued to scream and said that if he didn't pull her out, she would burn the bag to the ground. But the guy, smiling happily, told her to think carefully about what she was sitting in and also how this fire would affect her own body. Having calmed down a little, the girl turned to him and asked, "Does he really need her tiny kingdom so much?" After thinking, the man replied that in fact her kingdom was no more than a duchy to him, and he certainly had no reason to lie. Considering that Croy occupied a third of the continent, he had no desire to engage in morsels. He needed something else that was on her territory. And this something, in fact, was a river that ran through the very center of the kingdom. As soon as Sophia heard this, she became indignant and asked, "Is he really serious about this?" At that moment, the guy began to untie her bag, and Sophia continued to talk about how, as he had just said himself, this river cuts through the center of the country, and she did not understand how this was different from the desire to get her kingdom. Then suddenly he interrupted her screams and asked, purely out of curiosity, whether she even knew what state her river was in. The girl, proudly raising her head up, said that she was absolutely sure that this river was flowing as always. But Lennox replied that he would very much like this to be true. However, in reality, this river stopped flowing more than half a century ago due to quarrels in the middle of the river. As soon as Sophia heard about this, she was very surprised and asked, "Is it really all because of the thorn bushes?" Taking a deep breath, the emperor said he didn't know the exact reasons. However, it was their best guess, as it was quite logical. In any case, 6 months ago this problem was not as serious as it is now. Water comes not only from the ground, but also falls from the sky, so it was not a problem for them. At this point, Sophia realized where he was leading with all this, and asked, was it really true that they were now in a drought? And that was why water was not reaching them at all? Lennox replied that this was indeed the case, and asked if she would believe that there had not been a drop of rain in the south for the last 6 months. As soon as Sophia heard this, she froze in place. Her heart began to beat strongly, and she could not believe that this was actually true. Now it became clear to her why the ruler of a great empire personally went to a small kingdom that had been neglected for more than 100 years. It was all done for the sake of his own people. So, looking at him with a shining gaze, she said that, apparently, he turned out to be a ruler with a kind heart. As soon as Lennox heard this, he looked at her in surprise and asked what she was even saying. But the girl repeated that he turned out to be much nicer than at first sight. And besides, there was nothing surprising about it. The emperor did not understand at all what she was saying all this for, and also said that that is why he is a ruler, in order to protect his people from troubles. Also at that moment, he thought that no one had ever complimented him like that. Everyone usually took his actions for granted and never paid attention to how much work he puts into it. But Sophia came closer to him, put her wing on his hand, and said that he had probably been carrying a very heavy burden until now. But the guy, despite the fact that it was support, felt very uncomfortable about it. So he got up from his seat rather quickly and started to leave. Opening the door, he saw a surprised Orwell, who immediately asked if everything was okay with him. But the emperor grabbed him by the shirt and began to pull him back in. The commander of the magicians, very surprised, asked what he was doing. The man did not explain anything in detail, but only said that he thought he was right after all. This princess, or rather chicken, was magical after all. As soon as Orwell heard this, he was immediately very surprised and asked again, "What is he even saying?" Meanwhile, the emperor quickly explained to him what had happened, and when the magician listened to all this, he immediately began to look at this chicken in surprise. Then he sighed, touched his head, and said that he had complimented him regularly. So he asked him to stop underestimating him like that. But Lennox suddenly started yelling at him and told him not to take his words for granted. This girl knows how to control people's emotions, and this proves the correctness of his own theory. Orwell, of course, was not as surprised as his boss because she had only paid him a compliment, and the man thought that she had used some kind of magic. So he was about to explain to the man what was what, but then Lennox suddenly interrupted him and asked, "Does he really have such a kind heart?" Of course, the guy understood that in this whole situation he was ruining his own reputation, but they argued among themselves for a long time, and Sophia, meanwhile, carefully watched all this. And then suddenly, one thought came to her mind. Perhaps the empire of Croy will soon fall, and this guy can't even accept a compliment. And so some time passed from that time. Sophia was finally transferred to the emperor's office, and there she could now do what she wanted. And her first victim, of course, was Kem, who was a proud member of the Order of the Eagle, which defended the empire of Croy. Recently, in addition to grueling training and daytime work, he was somehow also assigned night shifts, for which he was not even paid extra. He knew very well that he had sworn an oath to the emperor to serve him as a loyal knight. However, he considered this to be a complete abuse of power, so he considered it unacceptable as well. But he couldn't do anything about this man. He was also irritated by the fact that the guy took him to his room when he could finally rest. So, at the very first call of the emperor, he came to his office, bowed, introduced himself, and also said that he had been told that he was waiting for him in his office. But then suddenly he raised his head up and saw that right in front of the emperor there was a chicken sitting on a rather soft couch. Of course, Kem was incredibly surprised when he saw her, but Leonic explained at that moment that he would like to give him the opportunity to leave his mark not only in the history of the empire, but also in the history of the entire continent. The boy, kneeling, looked in horror at the animal and did not understand how his mark in history could be connected with the princess who was reincarnated as a bird. But the emperor at that moment stood up and, turning to the gentleman, said that he was sure that he himself had already understood that this matter was so confidential that its safety depended on the entire empire. As soon as the guy heard about the top-secret mission, his eyes immediately lit up, and he said that, of course, he would not tell anyone anything, and it would be an honor for him to complete this task. Then Lennox said that this was very good, and asked if the man remembered how they saved Princess Sophia in the kingdom of Soyon. The knight replied that, of course he remembered, and it even seemed to him that he would not forget it for the rest of his life. And the man, coming closer to him, said that he had recently been told that perhaps this chicken might not be a princess, but a magician who had cursed her. That Princess Sophia, who was there in the form of a chicken, of course denied this theory. So in this way, he would like Mr. Chen to take the fate of the empire into his own hands and be able to fulfill what he asks. The knight, as soon as he heard that the fate of the empire would be in his hands, immediately beamed with joy. But Lennox asked if he would become their hero and kiss the princess to save the whole world. Of course, upon hearing this, the boy was no longer so happy. And after a short silence, he turned to His Majesty. And I asked him, does he understand correctly that when he says kiss, he means that he should touch the tip of her beak and its upper part with his lips? As soon as all three of them heard this question, they were incredibly surprised, because it was a question that had never arisen for them. After all, they did not know how exactly to kiss, because the chicken had a completely different structure of its beak. Of course, even Sophia herself believed that the entire beak is the genus, so it doesn't matter where you kiss. Then Orwell suddenly spoke up and said that it didn't matter where, you just had to finally do it, because it was already quite late, and everyone wanted to rest. Chen, of course, was not happy with this possibility, but in a trembling voice he said that in that case he would begin so as not to delay them all. Then he touched Her Highness's tender and small face with his hand and asked her forgiveness for what was about to happen. At that moment, Sophia was incredibly happy, and in anticipation of the fact that her curse would finally be lifted. But as soon as the boy kissed her beak, nothing happened. After that, the Emperor's voice was heard, saying that he didn't think the man was the one. But they were really grateful to him for this attempt, so they said that he could leave now. Before leaving their room, Chen apologized to her. Sophia was already really disappointed that nothing had worked out. At that moment, the Emperor himself began to take off his cloak, in which he was already feeling hot, and said that he was already beginning to get tired. The princess, at this point, sighed heavily and suggested ending it there, since she was squeezed like a lemon. So she asked to be left alone, and simply not touched for a while. Then Lennox asked her to allow him to say something, and without waiting for an answer, he said that all his life he had no intention of kissing anyone except his empress. He also said that it didn't matter whether it was a chicken or a person. At that moment, Sophia looked at him and asked if the mole really had such high moral principles as royalty. But the man, angry, said that she was thinking about something completely different, because he meant that he had decided to break his oath, and at that moment he came closer to her. He looked her straight in the eyes and asked if he was the hero she needed. Then he should sacrifice himself for the empire. The magician turned around at that moment, because he didn't want his eyes to rot at the sight of this scene. And Sophia, meanwhile, tried to fight off the emperor, asking him to let her go. And when Lennox grabbed her, she started screaming even more for him to leave and call the knights again, so that they could start all over again and check again. But at that moment, she suddenly thought that he had somehow learned the most dangerous way to hold a chicken, because the way he held her was very convenient for the girl, but at the same time, she could not get out. But at that moment, the man approached her and began to kiss her with his lips right on her beak. When it finally ended, Sophia fell down and was breathing heavily. She didn't understand if this was her punishment for all those secret kisses with the knights, but she thought it would be too cruel. Of course, Sophia was very sorry that she had done this, and turning to the Almighty, she said that she would pay for all her sins, but it would be better if no one kissed her again. Then suddenly the girl looked at the two guys, who had very surprised and even frightened expressions on their faces. She immediately asked what was the matter. Sophia sat and looked at them with confusion. At that moment, Orwell bowed and congratulated His Highness. The guy also said that now, since he was the very hero who lifted the age-old curse, all people would rejoice and give him praise. Sophia immediately began to examine her body and wondered if he had really lifted her curse. But when she saw the same white wings and yellow paws, she said that she was still a chicken. At that moment, Lennox turned to the man irritably and asked if this was really what he thought a broken curse looked like. Sophia, who was completely emotional, turned to him and asked them to fill her in on what they were talking about. But the magician, bowing, said that, of course, it had not been completely removed, but since he too could now understand the princess, they had indeed moved forward a little. After that, he pointed his finger at the color of her tail, and said that even that had changed, which meant that there was progress after all. As soon as Sophia looked back, she immediately saw that the tips of her tail feathers had indeed turned yellow, and she replied that in that case, the rest of the curse would soon be lifted. But as soon as she looked at the emperor and saw even more fear in his gaze, she realized that things would be difficult. At this point, Orwell turned to the princess and said that he could understand what she was thinking, and then he asked His Highness how well he wielded a sword. The boy replied that he couldn't say he had any outstanding skills. He was about 5 when it became clear that he was a mediocre swordsman. At this point, Sophia asked if he was calling him a hero or a warrior. The man, sighing heavily, replied that it was a very stupid question because he didn't know who was called that. Then she suddenly started screaming again and asked why he was the one who could lift her curse. Why, of all the people on the planet, was it him? Then the emperor explained that perhaps it was because the heroes, warriors, and knights, they all followed his orders. Thus, he was superior to them all. Sophia was furious that this could really be the only reason. Then she turned to the magician and asked if it was possible that Mr. Chen's kiss had some effect. But just a little later, Orwell, shaking his head from side to side, replied that he very much doubted it. Most likely it was the gentleman who had somehow influenced her. Sophia was simply in despair at that moment. She said that she could not believe all this. And the magician turned to His Highness and whispered to him that, hearing a woman's voice, he thought that she was a princess after all. But the emperor replied that this could be so. However, there is no guarantee that the magician is not actually a woman. As soon as Sophia heard this, she immediately looked at him and asked what he was saying. Lennox calmly replied that it could also be a man with a high voice, so Orwell should be more open-minded. The emperor continued to smile and said that this could be a clever plan by a magician who was counting on their weakness for stereotypes. Sophia couldn't take it anymore. She started yelling at him very loudly and asked what he was even saying. Flying closer to him, she began to scratch him with her claws and said that she had heard enough of his nonsense, and Orwell at that moment stood satisfied and thought that this would definitely keep them busy for some time. And again at that moment the guy thought about just quitting and not putting up with all this. One day the emperor asked Sophia whether she thought that the river belonged only to her state. But the girl understood perfectly well that this was not so, because the river that flows through the center of Sun is a gift of nature, and the kingdom simply borrowed it. However, the royal couple could not protect her because of the centuries-old curse. So great must have been the responsibility for this disaster. When the boy and girl finally calmed down a little, Sophia said that she was really sorry. As the princess of the kingdom of Sakina, she should have taken better care of this river, so that other countries would not have such problems. She also said that she really wanted to do something to help with the drought, but the man said that she shouldn't worry about it. Of course, if it rained, it would help their fields a lot, or if the Seine River returned to its normal course. However, the aqueducts had not yet dried up, so everything was fine for now. Therefore, he asked the girl not to be so strict with herself. As he left the room, he suggested with a smile on his face that they discuss everything else tomorrow. But now it was late, and it was time for both of them to go to bed. Of course, the emperor did not go to bed because he still had a lot of paperwork to do, and when he came to his office, he was horrified by what he read. Of course, he told the girl that there was no such great misfortune, that there was no river and no rain. However, Said's curse came through the river, and now they are plagued by infection. He remembered the last meeting that took place, and when the elders told him about all this, he considered it stupid and wondered why the curse, which had been silent for more than 100 years, suddenly returned. One of the elders said that the drought has been with them for half a year, and that is why the people are starting to riot. So they must make a sacrifice to do something. A man suddenly agreed with him and said that they should sacrifice this chicken to appease God's wrath. Now, as the man sat in his office writing various papers, he considered it absolutely absurd to sacrifice in their day. In the end, he wrote one very important document with the thoughts that this competent elder definitely did not belong on his committee. The next morning, when Sophia came to the emperor's office, she asked the maids to help her dress. She wore a small crown and a beautiful ornament on her neck, and as soon as she was carried into the room on a large, beautiful cushion, the maid immediately said that Her Highness, Princess Sophia Brianna, 5th Seine, had arrived. After this, the maid turned to Orwell and asked him to show respect. The wind held back his laughter. Then Sophia turned to him and told him not to laugh. But the guy still couldn't hold back his laughter, especially when he heard her voice, and laughed almost throughout the entire estate. Of course, this made the girl very angry because she considered it disrespectful. She quickly threw off this crown and said that she wanted to talk to him about something and was able to find a good time when the emperor was not in his office. When Orwell asked the girl what she was talking about, she said that she had been thinking all night and thought that there was another way to deal with the drought. At this point, the man immediately became interested and asked, "Is this method really in the spell books she wrote?" The girl was a little surprised when he mentioned her books, but said that it was exactly like that. Without thinking twice, the guy immediately rushed from his place and began to put many books on the table in front of her. He said that he would be very grateful if she could explain all these texts to him, and he suggested starting with what language they were written in. Then Sophia, hearing this, immediately understood that it was quite natural because they didn't know. Taking one of the books in her beak, she said that she did not understand what kind of magician would write books of spells without providing several safety precautions. So, opening the book, she raised her head up and told him to look carefully and remember. Well, as soon as she looked down and saw what was written there, she was very surprised. And as soon as something unusual happened, Orwell looked at her and said that this was exactly what he wanted to warn her about. At that moment, the girl sat next to her books in her true form and could not believe that this had really happened, because she thought that such a thing would never happen again. At that very moment, the guards came to the emperor and began to drive out one man. It was the elder whom he had just fired the previous evening. At that very moment, Orwell came to him and told him everything. What had happened? She had transformed into her true form for literally 5 minutes. The man immediately thought about it and thought that the portrait was probably not lying. She really is a beautiful girl. And when the guy asked if she was beautiful, the magician touched his heart but said nothing. At that moment, Lennox laughed loudly and said that he was just joking. And then he asked what the problem was that he ran to him so quickly. He also said that he kissed her, so he doesn't understand why the curse was only partially lifted. He also said that the man, since he is an imperial mage, should know the answer for sure. Then Orwell explained that all this happened because it was not true love's kiss. As soon as the emperor heard about this, he was immediately very surprised and asked what he was talking about. He considered it complete nonsense and even madness, saying that it simply couldn't be. But he also thought about what one should expect from this guy in principle. And all because Orwell of his own free will married for love 3 years ago, and he already had 2 children and a loving family. Then the guy asked if this wouldn't be a wonderful opportunity to finally throw the Empress, whom everyone had been waiting for so long, to the meek. The man also said that if the emperor could lift the curse from her and make the last surviving queen of the Sakin kingdom his empress, then his story would be passed down from generation to generation, and bards would even compose songs about it. He also said that history books will call him a unique story of true love and everyone will look up to him. After a short silence, Lennox turned to him and said that he was curious whether it was true that he did not receive any secret pleasure from this. Orwell smiled and said of course not. He just hadn't forgotten how much help and caring advice the man had given him over the years, when he was just dating his wife, so he wanted to repay him in kind. But as soon as the emperor saw his expression, he immediately realized that it was all sarcasm. Well, then suddenly Lennox turned to him and said that in that case he definitely owed him, of course. 5 years passed, and he really did fall into the lake, but still, that was where it all started. The magician sighed heavily and said that he knew all of this very well. That was why he would do everything in his power to repay this favor properly. After this he asked, "Is it really such a small Morocco to choose an empress from hundreds of noble ladies?" After thinking for a moment, the emperor was silent and then asked what Princess Sophia was doing at that moment. Orwell became a little sad and said that she was very sad because she had only been a person for a moment and refused to even leave her room, lay there alone and did not let anyone in. So after that he wondered why His Highness didn't go and see her. He thought she would be very pleased. As soon as the man heard about this, he realized that he was probably being quite serious. And then he asked what made him change his mind. Orwell explained that Princess Sophia had suggested a way to solve the drought problem in the south, and frankly, he thought it should be seriously considered because it really could help. He also said that this girl was a great magician and the last surviving royal of Said, so she knows exactly what she is talking about. Here, the emperor suddenly thought about it and asked if he was right in thinking that in this way they could make this kingdom part of the empire much easier. Mac looked at him seriously and said that it was indeed so. Then the man became happy and replied that he was not mistaken after all. However, there was one thing he had not taken into account. As soon as he looked at the emperor in surprise, the latter immediately asked what kind of factor it was, and the man explained that he had not taken into account. Orwell had not included Lennox in all these plans at all. After this, he asked, "Is the king really in such a desperate situation that he should just go and marry this princess even though he does not want to?" His assistant replied that if one weighed the pros and cons, he believed that it was indeed a good and necessary idea. Lennox stood up from his seat at this point and said that he believed that he might be forced to marry her. However, since they were talking about his marriage, he should certainly have a say in the choice. After that, he put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said that things don't always go as planned in the world, especially when it comes to issues like this. After that, the emperor simply walked away, leaving him alone. He headed straight for the princess,